I left my heart on the top of a windowsill, fell apart when the winds pulled it down. On the ground where the sun drove the colors deep, in the summer heat the colors seemed to drown. In the summer heat the colors seemed to drown. But you pulled up the colors with a simple tune. You breathed the songbook, dusted off the sand. You put the pieces on your sleeve, oh, you gave my heart to me. It looked so pretty that I fell on my knees. It looked so pretty that I...
Please tell us your immigration story.
Throughout growing up, my parents didn't really talk about their story or what that really meant. It was just like, yeah, you have family in Vietnam, and then we go back and visit every 5 years or so. In terms of my immigration story, I was born in Victoria, BC, which is the traditional and the unceded territory of the Lekwungen and the Sanak Nations. I was born to an immigrant family, so my parents were refugees from Vietnam. They left in the late 80s, specifically 1986. My brother was only 20 days old. There was like a boat of about 20 people that my dad sailed. He was the one that sailed them from Vietnam to Hong Kong. On that boat there was other families, so I think she was telling me there was other young children who were anywhere from 2 years old to 6 years old. And then there were our own family members as well as neighbors. And people at that time left because the communist government, you know, the resources were very minimal. Everyone had to have the same thing, access to the same thing, which often wasn't enough. And then at the time, the communist government recently announced that Chinese nationals, so people who are Chinese descent, were no longer going to be allowed to be in the country. And that set like a strange precedence, and people were getting afraid of like, well, if this is how our government's going to run, what does that mean for us? And so they left a lot of people. It was considered like one of the mass exoduses. The first one being mostly South and Central Vietnamese people fleeing Vietnam after the war. And so this second mass wave of exodus was even people from the north at this point. So they were in Hong Kong in a refugee camp for 2 years before being granted asylum to Canada. And at that point, people had opportunities to either go to Canada. I think there were some opportunities to go to the United States or go to Australia, where my uncle actually ended up going. And that was because they didn't believe that my uncle was my mom's brother, even though he was. So it's really interesting how one decision, an official person, like whoever this border security person was, they just made this decision, I don't believe you. And then because of that very particular reason, my uncle gets sent to Australia and doesn't come to Canada with us.
Can you tell me your migration story?
I was born in Bangladesh. When I was 4 years old, I moved to Canada. I moved between cities, Toronto, Vancouver. Then I went coast to coast. I went to Newfoundland and Gander. And then I moved back to Vancouver. My dad kind of struggled finding a job, and we had a big family, so we just moved around a lot.
My mom's education wasn't recognized, so she had to end up caring for the elderly as a, I guess, care worker. Well, back in Vietnam, she was a nurse, so she wasn't able to transfer her credentials over here. And then she became a hairdresser. And then eventually, like I was born, and then by the time I was about 11, at that point my parents had divorced, and so I was living with my mom and my brother, and then my mom decided to move to Vancouver because at that point a lot of the Vietnamese community was moving over here for more opportunities for work.
Why did you move to Canada?
So the decision was made by my mom. In Philippines, the poverty is very strong there. You can't live a life where it's secure and safe, and so she made a biggest choice to go to Canada, but because of papers, like a lot of policies change, you have to stay in Saudi Arabia. But overall, the reason why we both moved to Canada is that Canada was promised to be secure and safe.
Were there any issues you faced when you got here? Any major issues or minor ones you want to share?
When we got here, the strike was going on, and I couldn't get into school, and then I thought it's okay since I can go to summer school. But then, even then, my papers weren't fully processed. The strike continued on, so by the time I was able to get to school, I lost an entire year, so I had to go back another year. So I had to do grade 11 again. That was an issue I faced with not having processed papers.
Did you encounter any cases of bullying?
A lot, especially in smaller towns. We used to live in Gandhi and Newfoundland. We were living 2 years. And not just me, but my siblings were bullied a lot in high school. I was in elementary school where I was bullied, and my older siblings were bullied in high school.
Why do you think so? What's the big reason for it?
Biggest reason probably would be because we're a minority, so we were a target in that small town. We kind of just stood out. We were like those only brown people, nobody else was brown.
Are there any obstacles you faced upon settling in Canada?
Definitely. First off, when I lived in Canada, the culture shock was big. There was Filipinos, but it wasn't like a unified community. The language barriers, but I think the biggest obstacle for me was that not finding the relationships. You can understand that, like in a community where everyone is coming from a different culture, and it's cool to be like in a party together, but having that cultural support where you can embrace and indulge in being a Filipino and finding those cultures, I feel like you don't have that here. And I feel like you can say that happens to a lot of communities here.
Please describe how you feel about your life in Canada.
In terms of my life in Canada, I don't know how I feel about it. I feel like I haven't really thought about those things or had anyone ask me, which I guess says something about kind of the world that we're in right now. Not taking the time to think about like what that means. I would say that I'm very privileged to be here for a lot of different reasons, economically, as well as being a person who's abled and can navigate this land very, very easily without barriers when it comes to those things. And then I think about some of the other barriers I have where I identify as first generation Vietnamese and I'm racialized and I don't look white, although I sound white and can talk like I'm white or perhaps engage in white culture, Western culture very easily. So it's really interesting navigating that in Canada. And being queer, gender fluid, being a youth, those are big barriers trying to navigate, work, trying to navigate even social life, and just navigate communities, different communities across the country when I get the opportunity to travel. I find life in Canada is complicated in terms of being very, very lucky to have citizenship here, and access to healthcare, access to resources like clean water, to electricity, to a whole host of different things that many people in this country don't actually get access to, at least have barriers or have a hard time accessing them. And I find so in terms of like, for myself, how I kind of view it, it's also on an emotional level really hard. Feeling like I'm split apart at different parts of how I see myself, and even with my family and my relationships, feeling both opportunities to connect as well as tensions in relationships as well because of living here, and the challenges that come with not being from here, so to speak.
My biggest obstacle in facing Vancouver is that the community's values are so different from traditional versus our new generation, our new found mentality here in Canada, where you understand what is discrimination. I feel like in those traditional communities there's such a gap, because what they find funny is very homophobic or very transphobic, or there's just so many different forms of discrimination that a lot of people don't want to recognize in those communities. It's because maybe they didn't know about it, maybe it's too standard, it's too normalized in their communities that they don't find it wrong. And that to me is like, what kind of conditioning are you in? And also that also crosses towards of like, how can we talk about mental health in our communities? And so just talking about my values comparing to the traditional values of my community, it's very difficult to connect with them.
Do you know the problems immigrants face?
Problems they face? Well, an obvious one would be fitting in to a new society, a new culture. Some other problems would be the language, obviously, if they don't have any backgrounds in English. But of course, here there are a lot of resources for different ethnic groups and everything for learning English, and kind of guiding their way in their own language. What else? That's probably society, language, the new cultures, new values, different values. Yeah.
What is your message to youth immigrants?
Y'all need to talk. Stay inspired, stay connected with your community, not just by your family or your race, but like people who you love that take cares of you. Not just maybe physically, but also mentally, emotionally, something that makes you grow. Those are the things that I wish I heard when I first came to Canada, and hopefully you do too. Home is more about like both hands welcoming you as you are, rather than like conforming you to another standard. And so home is where the people are.